So where we are now, it's the very end of May 2024, and for a number of months we've been anticipating what this year's spate of legislation is likely to look like for potential inclusion in the FY25 National Defense Authorization Act. This is the big omnibus Armed Services and Intelligence Bill, because it tends to cram in the Intelligence Authorization Act, that the last several years worth of UAP legislation has kind of gotten bundled into. And last year in mid-July, we saw the introduction both of the Schumer Rounds Bipartisan UAP Disclosure Act, and interestingly on the same day was when Tim Burchett introduced his version of UAP legislation on the House's side. So, this late spring into summer timeframe is when myself, UAP Caucus, a number of other organizations, and I should say that's UAPcaucus.com, Lester Nare's effort, the civic engagement effort, not the House UAP Caucus. But that organization, Declassify UAP, a number of us who are kind of in this UAP transparency activism space, we've been kind of waiting with bated breath to see what legislation, both on the Senate and the House side, gets introduced for this upcoming year's National Defense Authorization Act, which will be the NDAA for the FY25, fiscal year 25. And so we've now started to see what's shaping up. In just the last handful of days, Representative Robert Garcia, he's the California 42nd District, I think it includes Long Beach, Rep. Garcia introduced two pieces of UAP legislation a couple days ago for the House's version of the NDAA in one day. He introduced what's essentially a rehashing of the Schumer Rounds UAPDA, but he's now kind of offering it as a portion of the House's FY25 NDAA. That's an important move because last year, the Schumer Rounds UAP Disclosure Act, this was introduced in the Senate. It was introduced by amendment. It didn't kind of go through the kind of committee process that determines what a lot of that legislation will be that ends up in the NDAA. It was kind of introduced somewhat last moment by the leader of the Senate and managed to make its way and was approved for the Senate's version of the NDAA. So what Rep. Garcia has done is he essentially took that language that was introduced by Schumer and Rounds and their associates in the Senate, and now he's introduced it for the House's own version of the NDAA. Viewers who are watching this have to remember, many of these larger bills, they essentially get crafted simultaneously in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And then through a process called reconciliation, the two versions of these bills that each body independently kind of passes, they have to get essentially squashed together through a negotiation process we call reconciliation into a final version of the bill that's the same, that then again each chamber will have to vote on once again, but it's the same version of the bill at that point that's getting voted on by both chambers. And if both pass that reconciled bill, it moves up to the president to be signed into law. So it's a big deal that the House now has this significant UAP Disclosure Act, as it was originally termed in the Senate, also coming from the House side. Simultaneously with that, Rep. Garcia also introduced this bill known as the Safe Airspace for Americans Act. This is one of the bills that the Americans for Safe Aerospace, that was founded by Ryan Graves, has put forth to create an official reporting mechanism for civilian pilots who have UAP sightings and encounters. There's really not such a mechanism today through the Federal Aviation Administration. So Garcia introduced both kind of a House version of the UAPDA and this flight safety UAP related bill, both for inclusion in the House's NDAA. And what will happen is, because those on the House side were not introduced through the committee process, he is asking for the House to sort of broadly vote on those as amendments to get added into the House NDAA. So that's like just happened in the last couple days and is a huge part of sort of what we've been waiting to see might come out of the House. And this is actually some of the most significant UAP-related legislation that we've yet seen come up through the House. Most of the UAP legislation from the last several years has really come from Senate actions and then has kind of made its way into the final reconciled bill. So it's a big deal that now the House is sort of putting their fingers on the scale and saying, you know, we want to see some of this UAP legislation, the significant legislation, you know, air safety, the UAP Disclosure Act. And so that's kind of just where we've arrived in the last few days, and us activists have kind of been like not only waiting for that, but oh my goodness, like this is more substantial than we've seen out of the House over the last few years. So what we're waiting for is to see where the Senate is. And we are now, as a coalition of activist organizations, going to really be trying to drive US voters to engage with their own elected officials, other elected officials who have been kind of associated with the UAP issue for pro and con, to really let them know that the US public overwhelmingly supports these kinds of bills making it into law. And so we're now, like, literally as I get home from, you know, the SCU conference, we're going to continue our inter-organization organizing that we've been very much doing. I was just on a call with UAPcaucus.com the other day, and we're kind of planning out our strategy to drive these voter engagement efforts over the next few months. We're now waiting to see what comes out of the Senate. We have a sense that a sort of UAP DA 2.0, maybe much like last year's bill, including the independent kind of presidential review board, will also come from the Senate side, make it into the Senate NDAA, and now we'll have both bodies of Congress with their own NDAA bills, each having significant UAP legislation, kind of heading into the season where the real behind-the-scenes negotiations happen. And this is where the public just needs to be as loud and consistent as possible. We want to see this legislation pass. There is no real resistance to this among the voting public. The public has a wide interest in this topic and coming to an understanding of what's going on and treating it responsibly. So it's like, we're just about to gear up for this year's set of battles around these bills.
Well, Nick, that's amazing. And I think the other thing that is amazing is since the outcry over the act being gutted, right, the UAP Disclosure Act, the Schumer-Rounds Act, it had a lot of these things in it, and those things were gutted, I think, in December, right? To see that reintroduced, it's almost as if, you know, these bills are, it's almost like they've got their teeth sunk in and they don't want to let go, you know? And I think that's amazing, because in the past, I think the impression that people have had is for every step forward, there are 2 steps backward, you know, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And now what we're seeing are, even if you got that bill, we're going to come back because we want to see this change, right? That's the impression that I get.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's a message that I've been trying to repeat as often as possible, Tim, that people, American citizens, and people around the world, but speaking here as kind of American voters and our set of laws that we're talking about, we need to have the wherewithal to kind of push through the roller coaster ride of the legislative ups and downs, right? And I like to remind people, and again, you know, UFO world, and I say that in a very endearing sense, although it has its, you know, idiosyncrasies to it. But, you know, a lot of people in UFO world aren't necessarily, some of them are, but not everyone is super involved with politics and other forms of legislation and lots of other issues. I mean, we might have those concerns, but, you know, I actually love this, that the UAP issue is kind of serving as a point of education for how a lot of these processes work for people who aren't necessarily so engaged with the legislative process, and even, you know, making contact with their own representatives and, you know, letting them know what they think is their constituent. So I'm frankly thrilled that UAP of all issues can sort of be a vehicle for getting people to understand how these processes work. And last year was a major educational activity for many people, American voters who support these bills, who didn't necessarily know about the process of reconciliation and how each body in Congress kind of has its own version of the bill, and there's like a lot of backroom dealing for the final bill to be arrived at, and that's a very opaque process, and, you know, it's not 100% clear. We have indicators, but it's not obvious to the average member of the public, why did the UAPDA get scrapped? That was like a backroom thing. We have really very little visibility into that. We have a sense of, Mike Turner and Mike Rogers from Alabama. They might have been involved in pulling that out of the final UAPDA, but we don't know for sure. It's a very backroom, cigar smoke and brandy kind of thing. It's like how I imagine it anyway. And so people are also being educated through this process that you might get big pieces of what you were pushing for, and we can't forget, significant UAP legislation was passed last year. It came up through the Intelligence Authorization Act, and it essentially made it illegal to run UAP programs that the Congress is not being briefed into. That was a big deal. That passed. The NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, has created a group within the organization that has put out the call to every federal agency, because this did make it into the UAP, into the NDA last year. You need to send us all of your records on UAP.
Yeah.
Now, it's a self-policing thing, which is a problem, and why people like myself aren't necessarily expecting a ton to come of that effort. But it's important to say, big pieces of UAP legislation did make it through that process. However, we didn't get the Presidential Review Board, which is made up of a number of independent people who can't have been connected to the UAP issue. They can't have worked for shady government UAP programs. It's very explicit in the bill. Big pieces of that didn't make it through, like that review board, and also the eminent domain clause, which kind of said that the government has the fundamental right to any kind of far-out technology that might have landed on our soil if that's ever come into any private possession. And we're not talking about little scraps of metal here. That needs to be said. We're not talking about, frankly, Gary Nolan or Jacques Vallée's, collection of interesting little metallic fragments and such. The language was really geared at someone who might have a craft or something of that caliber that actually has significant national security implications to it, and that the government really should, frankly, have the right to.
Well, now, if it's okay, I wanted to ask, again, this has been pulling teeth, right? And it seems like normal legislation does not take this long or this difficult or require this many people involved. Do you think that in itself is some kind of a veiled admission of guilt?
I'm going to push back. It's a good question, and it does represent the impression that many reasonable people have when looking at this process, looking at that opaqueness, picturing the backroom deals that get significant parts of the UAP language scrapped out. I get that. It's frustrating, and it stinks to have to push through that. I just remind people how many years certain communities in the United States were waiting for, say, the right to get married to the people that they want to marry.
Okay.
That wasn't a one and done kind of thing. That was generations of work. Or think about environmental legislation that takes years, decades even, to push through. All sorts of different laws that get passed that the public are widely behind can take literally generations. I'm going to flip this around. We've seen more significant progress in terms of meaningful UAP legislation get introduced into a several-year period than is analogous to any other significant issue that we would put on the level of UAP and everything that implies. I actually see that the rate of progress is significant at this point. Significant, huge amounts of motivation. Again, Robert Garcia introducing this legislation in just the last few days on the House side. This bodes really well for our movement and the UAP transparency and declassification issue. We're moving fast. And yeah, we didn't get it all in one go. It's actually been several years of building UAP legislation. Here's my bet. When we're having this conversation 3 years from now, and then we look back at what will now have been 6 years of legislative efforts around the topic, it's not going to be the same conversation. We're going to be happy with where things are at. We kind of should be pretty happy with where things are at today, even relative to 3 years ago. So it can be disappointing. We have to push through it. I'm going to say that again. It's very important for the people who care about this topic immensely, many of whom have cared about it for decades. I've been into this for decades. We have to take these little hits that happen. We have to push through them and it has to, if anything, just reinforce the movement that we've created. And there was a significant announcement today of a new UAP transparency organization that has Gary Nolan, Chris Mellon, Lou Elizondo, and other significant folks, Carl Nell, on their board. And I can't emphasize enough how big a deal that is, because Declassify UAP, we've been wanting to see, dare I say it, those exact people make a very clear set of statements and actions to the public, the US voting public. We need you to engage around this. We need you to help us. You know, we've got the backside stuff going. We've got our Plan B and Plan C, as it's been called. We need the public to meet us halfway. And the fact that as of today, this has been launched and is now being officially messaged by those people, it's a huge deal. It's something I have been pressing for, hoping for, praying for, and frankly, asking them for. And it's clearly being heard. And this is a huge step in the progress that we're going to make over the next few years.
That's amazing. That's amazing. To me, this year seems to be about coalition building and organizing. That has kind of been my takeaway. You know, I believe bridging the gap was the SCU's theme for this year, and what I'm seeing is coalitions being formed both in government, right? We're seeing that happen as, you know, the Congress and the Senate are working together. The other thing that I'm seeing is organizations like the SCU itself are reaching out and forming networks. And I think hopefully what that is that's the rising tide that lifts all ships, right? Where, you know, by communicating more effectively and working in coordination, and I don't see that as government versus activism. I think what I'm seeing and the tone that's coming out of this is the activist community is working with government, you know, and hopefully with private industry in the future, with these defense contractors, at least as much as they're willing. And so the entire thing seems to be coalition building and collaborative, which is, for me, that's the really exciting part.
It's humongous, and it can't be overemphasized, because, you know, one of the, I mean, you could call it the philosophy, that it's my personal philosophy, but I've tried to bake it into Declassify UAP, and certainly Lester has baked it into his efforts with UAPcaucus.com, as have other activists. It's very easy to kind of want to find villains with the UFO issue.
Yeah.
I get it, and there probably have been a fair share of such individuals and organizations over 80 years. However, that finding villains, roasting villains, you know, pillaring villains, that's not the same as making progress. I only really care about making progress on UAP transparency and for the public to learn the truth as far as the most informed people in government and industry, the military, the intelligence community understand it, wherever that truth leads, to the best of their understanding based on the best available data they have available to them. It doesn't mean we need every last little piece of sensor data coming off of classified platforms. We need to know what those folks actually think the truth might be, wherever it leads. And the way to do that, in my opinion, it's not by finding villains. We will have that opportunity. If justice needs to be served, we will find ways to do that. The bigger deal is creating the space for that level of a significant shift, if indeed it turns out to represent a significant shift in our understanding of things. We need to create the space for it to unfold. We need to create a space that allows things to shift towards transparency. And I mean, I tell people this openly. I've done business with these defense contractors. I've done business with some of the three-letter agencies that people might associate with this topic, not relating to this topic in any way, shape, or form, at least that I was aware of. You know, much more banal than UAP. However, I did get a chance to understand a little bit about how those organizations look, what it's like to walk around in their hallways and do business with them, and the kind of people who are involved, again, both as government employees and on the contractor side. I can tell you, most of them are not evil villains. Most of them are great people, very smart, really patriotic, really care about national security. It's really an like an overarching theme that they all really care about for everything I ever saw. And so we have to understand that if there is a big shift that's going to be involved with us learning the truth, wherever that leads, we have to create the set of circumstances that allow these very significant organizations and very powerful people and corporations, you name it, to flow into that new world that we're trying to create. And they're going to be part of it. They're going to be part of it, which means we need to invite them into being part of that change. And I get the impression many people in those organizations, the government employees, government contractors, high-level corporate overlords, I think a lot of them want this change to happen right now. We wouldn't have people like John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, saying things like UAP might represent a new form of life publicly. We wouldn't have Avril Haines, who is currently the highest-ranking member of the U.S. Intelligence Committee. She's the DNI, sit at the National Cathedral at a largely UAP-themed event saying, we're trying to figure out if some of the UAP in the other category are, and I joke, it's how she said it. She said they're trying to figure out if they're extraterrestrial. She kind of choked on the word a little bit. But that's not an insignificant statement coming from the DNI.
Yeah.
So this change is already occurring amongst the highest level national security officials we have. Obama has been on camera. Clintons are supportive of this topic. Trump's even mentioned it. We have Jimmy Carter. We had Ford. We had Reagan allude to this topic. We've had many high-level officials who have signaled over the years they are open to flowing into a whole new understanding of this topic and allowing the public to be part of that understanding. We've got to create the circumstances that allow them to do that as easily as possible.
Well, what do you think, and this really goes to just opinion, intuition, and gut feeling, right? But
which I rely on quite a bit, don't get me wrong.
Well, and the reason I ask, Nick, is because, like from my own opinion, which continues to shift, right? I was leaning towards AI, robotics, some kind of von Neumann probe, something along those lines, until David Grush came forward. And for me, he took things back towards your more traditional, at least that was how it appeared, more traditional UFO, right? With the little gray men and all of that.
Okay.
So what do you think, in terms of best guess, what are you betting the story is likely to be? Or do you have a best guess right now?
Oh, listen, I've been studying this topic since I was a little boy, very interestedly. Like, it's been a little bit of a life obsession. And the interesting thing, and part of my story is, it was never like a big effing deal to me. The big effing deal was, I can't believe they would cover up something like this. Like, that was the frustration of that circumstance was always a much bigger deal to me than what that underlying circumstance was. For whatever reason it is, maybe it was my karma, my upbringing, whatever it could be, it just never really shocked me that, like, there might be other things out there in this section of space-time. Like, I'm open to that. It doesn't faze me. My belief system isn't incompatible with it. So when you talk about my gut impression, let me answer this a little, broadly. You just said a number of different kind of categories of how people have understood this topic.
Yeah.
Von Neumann probes, AI, but then like biological entities, and sort of going back to that more traditional view of aliens. We're a very language-based species, us humans. We talk, we have a lot of words, it's how we communicate, but it's also often a holdup in our understanding, the labels that we choose to apply to things. We say, well, it's got to be this, so it's not that. Or I think it's more like this, but not this. And we look at these things as dichotomies. We look at them as options that are often, in our own minds and our own thinking, mutually exclusive. Here's what my gut tells me. We're going to learn that the set of labels we had, again, this is my gut here. I don't have hard evidence of this. I'm not trying to say I do. I don't have any privileged knowledge that I'm trying to convey here as a subject matter expert who's read in on certain details. This is just based on how I've read this topic for decades as an individual. We're going to learn that I think a lot of our labels were technically maybe hinting at something that could be. But we're also going to learn that looking at them individually and as mutually exclusive labels was too limiting. So I'll give you just an example here. If you were a really advanced civilization that had a presence across, say, a portion of this galaxy, let's just say, you've had that presence, it could be for hundreds of thousands of years, it could be for millions of years. There's no technical reason it couldn't be for billions of years. So we might be talking about presences that have been around a really long time. Now that doesn't mean they took a human trajectory of development in their own development, but it's just, we might be dealing with something that's a lot older than us as a kind of civilization in the terms that we would use. So, in the last 15 years or so, not even really, the field of synthetic biology, synbio, has started to become a really big thing. And it's using molecular biology, including DNA, all of the things we think of as biologic, natural, nature, all of these kind of connotations, we're actually using them as machinery and engineering around them. I worked for a company for about a year that's developing DNA-based data storage and computing technology, actually putting digital information into synthetically created DNA molecules that you can then compute on molecularly without having to pull it back into a traditional computing system. Molecular DNA computing as something we are designing. You can send a text file to a number of different companies now filled with A's, T's, C's, and G's and get back synthetically created DNA molecules or RNA molecules. We know this because it's in some of the vaccines we've been taking the last few years. So we like to think of natural and technology as this dichotomy, and it's one or the other. But we actually now know that there's no such requirement. You can use molecular biology as technology. So if we're doing that in the last 10, 15 years, CRISPR and all of these things people have heard of, it strikes me that a civilization that could have been around 1 million years or 10 million years or even maybe 1 billion years, they might not have a hard schism between what they consider technological and biological. Same thing with AI. We're at a point where we think of AI as this thing that lives on the internet and in servers and on computers and our ChatGPT app. And we are very different than AI. Everyone's heard, or lots of people have heard of Ray Kurzweil's idea of the singularity. A big part of that notion is that there could well be a convergence of what we think of conceptually as artificial intelligence and natural human intelligence. And these might end up becoming sort of the same thing. If that is something people as intelligent as Kurzweil are saying might happen in our next 10 years, 50 years, hell, call it a century or even 1,000 years. If you're a civilization that's been around 100 million years, chances are that convergence might have happened for you a really long time ago. So if there's even a chance we're dealing with something that might fall under the broad rubric of a post-singularity civilization or civilizations. And maybe by post, it could be like, yeah, we had our whole singularity thing 1 billion years ago. Because again, there's no technical scientific reason that can't be the case for what we're seeing. I mean, I'm not saying it is. It's just, there's nothing that takes that off the table. The idea that it's either or, it's life forms or it's an AI. It's technical or it's biological. I know it's a long-winded answer, but I think we're going to realize a whole constellation of labels might be required for us to even begin to come to terms with this. That's what this notion that's been kicked around over the last year or two, hyper objects, as it relates to the concept of UAP, is kind of speaking to. We can't think of it as a little circle in a knowledge graph with a couple of lines coming off of it connecting to like other concepts. We're talking about something potentially very complicated, very complex in its nature. That's an entire constellation of concepts and relationships and connections to other concepts, and we just might have to be very open-minded and very inclusive in our understanding of these things instead of saying, well, it's either this or this. So again, I'm not trying to insult people who are interested in these concepts. I think they're a very useful set of concepts to be thinking about as it relates to this topic. My gut tells me it's kind of like all of the above and something maybe way beyond all of that.
Well, no, I absolutely love that thought pattern, because for me, I've been calling that intersectionality, right?
Yes.
And like, I've been approaching not only AI, which brings its own set of moral and ethical questions, right? Which also apply to the UAP issue, because we're talking about non-human intelligence potentially.
And we're talking about using our own AI to understand it better. So it's
Exactly.
coming at it from all angles, right?
But, you know, then the other part is, like, again, I'm a big advocate of trying to take things like the Drake equation and exoplanet research and SETI and try and cross-pollinate there, right? Like, for instance, you've got between 100 and 400 billion suns in the Milky Way galaxy. Frank Drake had said something like 10,000 of those have radio-using civilizations. For every one of those, you may have thousands or millions with life and thousands or millions more with ancient ruins. And so, you know, this intersectionality based on existing estimates by reputable scientists suggests that we live in a universe that it's both ancient and probably full of life and full of diversity.
Teeming. And, yeah, I mean, again, just as a thought experiment, I certainly don't know. If one thing found us and had the capability of getting here, although again, I don't know that that's even the right frame of reference. It's just, again, if Earth happens to be located in a portion of space-time that is also accompanied by, say, an advanced type of civilization, there's a really good chance there's more than one, unless one already ate all the others. But we're still here. And we don't seem to clearly be representative of that. So we have reason to believe one didn't eat all of the others. And so if one thing is here, I'm just going to posit, it seems like maybe more than one thing is in this section of space-time along with us humans of Earth. So I think your approach of assuming diversity, maybe extreme diversity, maybe diversity of the likes that are human issues around diversity are like, you know, a mere rounding error. I think that's a really good inclination that people should follow and be very open to. And, you know, if it turns out to be something different based on available evidence, that's all well and good. But I think we should be very open to there not just being one answer that fits all of the stories that we've been told, all of the sighting encounters, all of the entity encounters, or, you know, all of those experiences. There could be a lot of different types of interactions with different things that are, you know, kind of a gestalt that we think of when we think of UFOs and ETs and NHI. But, you know, for all we know, there's a lot of different things that we're kind of coming into contact with in different ways, and we just need to see where the evidence takes us. And again, I come back to, it's why the public at least deserves the general understanding, not in a way that reveals national security secrets or, you know, top secret details about our most sensitive data acquisition platforms. We deserve to simply know what the best thinking by the most informed people indicates, so science can have potentially a light bulb moment, and we can start investigating this like we investigated microorganisms when, as some of the presentations today at SCU highlighted, microorganisms were discovered because in the birthing process, the midwives who had the kind of cultural knowledge to wash their hands before delivering babies were not passing what we now understand as germs to both the mother and newborn child. And so there was less deaths in those populations versus the actual medical establishment, which was like, oh, they didn't know about germs, they didn't know about microorganisms, and they didn't have that kind of cultural knowledge to do that. And so they were killing a lot more people in the actual medical institutions because they didn't think to wash their hands. And that one thing led to us learning that every surface around us, every part of our body, inside our body, I actually read a headline the other day, the microbiome extends into our brains, not just in our gut and sending messages up the vagus nerve, in our brains. We have countless varieties of microorganisms. They've been in our bodies since we were in the womb. We breathe them with every breath we take. And if you had told those doctors delivering those babies, there's an invisible presence, it affects us constantly, some of the side effects of it people have labeled as demons and other kind of things, they would have thought it was crazy. I mean, the idea of microorganisms everywhere around us and having a very intimate relationship with our being. I mean, life and death matters. They would have thought it was crazy. They did think it was crazy. And now we can't even imagine a realm in which we didn't have a basic understanding that there's microorganisms everywhere. We're like, yeah, kids in school looked at microscopes, we see these things, like no big deal. I like to hope, and it could be a decade, it could be a century, but I like to think that there will be a point where people similarly might laugh about UAP. And they say, isn't it so funny that for that little window of time in civilization, they just had no idea that, there might have been a bigger set of systems around us that we could have relationships with for all we know. That were always there, that future folk take completely for granted. They might know that, okay, there's reasons to be concerned in these circumstances and less concerned about others, and these ones might actually be good for us. Again, all the similar things that we understand about the microorganisms that surround us. But as a whole, people don't flip out about the fact that there's microorganisms, or most people don't. There are situations in which people have those complexes, and that's understandable. But people have issues. But most people just don't care that there's microorganisms everywhere, unless it's negatively affecting us immediately. And we change our behaviors. Most people wash their hands in certain circumstances, or at least you hope they do before they're preparing your meal or whatever, or delivering your child. We just don't get overwhelmed by it. We can study it, we can look at it scientifically, we can figure out how we want to respond to certain circumstances specifically in different situations. I really hope we can get there with UAP, Tim.
Well, so Nick, let me thank you so much for your time today. It's truly a privilege and an honor to be able to run through this, both with your organization as well as Lester Nare's. The work that you guys are doing is incredible change. It's incredible change. Do you think you can close this out by giving us some URLs and how people can get involved, why they should get involved,
Absolutely.
And what they should be doing?
Yes, so Declassify UAP, our website is declassifyuap.org, and then you can go to declassifyuap.org/action, and as a US voter, it lets you send a message to your own elected officials, and I really encourage every US voter to do this. It takes 30 seconds or less. Send them a message, fill out a few fields, hit send, and it lets your own elected officials, you as a constituent, letting them know, the people that you vote for and that represent you, you guys need to support government UAP transparency and declassification efforts. Lester Nare's website, uapcaucus.com, that's uapcaucus.com. You can go to uapcaucus.com/call. They have a call tool that lets US voters reach out to a broader set of elected officials, not just your own reps, but other reps who are connected to the UAP topic at this point, important kind of points of leverage in our legislative system to let them know as well. You guys need to support UAP declassification efforts. We need to have transparency around this topic once and for all. So, US voters need to stay engaged. They need to keep pushing their reps. They need to make phone calls to their reps' DC offices. You need to call some of the other key reps in Congress, both the House and the Senate, as well as the White House, to let them know what you think. And a greater and greater number of us need to keep doing this on a regular basis. This year, whatever happens, this year, next year, the year after, until we get the goods. And if you go to declassifyuap.org, there's a section called the Declassification Targets. It's a set of specific types of information about UAP we want to see declassified. And you can think of it as your checklist, because it's not about politicians paying this lip service or saying something that the public wants to hear. We have to get the goods. And those declassification targets, I think there's 7 of them, they give you a specific list of things that we need to keep in mind. This is what we're looking for. This is the information. And so we need to kind of keep that at the ready and see what politicians say, but more importantly, we need to see what they do and what they give us. So we got to keep pushing, we got to stay engaged, and I think this momentum is just going to continue to build. More and more organizations are hatching. This is a good thing. We're working together. Trust me, we're talking to each other, we're working behind the scenes. This is what organizing looks like, and it's happening.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Nick, thank you again.
Thank you,
so
Tim,
much.
and thank you for the work that you're doing. You bring light to so many important and interrelated issues, so please keep doing it and talking to the wonderful people that you bring on.
Absolutely.